The story of America rarely begins with a quiet morning, but perhaps it should. Long before headlines, speeches, and monuments, the country existed mostly in the soft, repetitive movements of ordinary life. People woke up with the sun, or sometimes before it. They made coffee or boiled water, or stepped outside to check the weather. Doors opened, shoes were put on. The nation, such as it was, did not feel like a nation at all. It felt like a collection of small habits performed in thousands of places at once. In small towns, the rhythm of the day was predictable. Stores opened at roughly the same time each morning. The same people walked the same streets, often greeting each other with the same words. Nothing important seemed to be happening, and that was precisely the point. Stability was created not through dramatic events, but through the absence of them. Life continued, not because of ambition or vision, but because it was easier to continue than to stop. Most Americans did not experience history as something unfolding. They experienced it as work. Farming, repairing, teaching, selling, cleaning. These were not considered acts of national importance. They were simply what needed to be done. Fields were planted because fields always had to be planted. Trains arrived because trains were scheduled to arrive. Letters were delivered because someone had to deliver them. The country functioned not through ideology, but through obligation. If someone had asked an average citizen what era they were living in, they might not have known how to answer. Time was not divided into periods and movements. It was divided into weeks, seasons, and years. There was harvest time. There was winter. There was the school term. There was the slow waiting between paydays. The idea that this ordinary flow would someday be studied or narrated would have seemed strange, even unnecessary. News traveled slowly, and when it arrived, it often felt distant. Newspapers described events in cities far away, decisions made by people whose faces were rarely seen. For most readers, these stories had little effect on what they would eat for dinner or when they would wake up the next morning. National affairs existed as background noise, secondary to the immediate concerns of weather, health, and income. Small towns were not centers of innovation, but centers of continuity. Buildings changed rarely. Streets kept the same names for decades. The same families often lived in the same areas for generations. Memory was local, not national. People remembered who owned which store, who had moved away, who had married, who had died. These were the events that felt real. Everything else felt abstract. Work was repetitive and often physically demanding, but rarely dramatic. Factories produced the same items day after day. Offices processed the same forms. Shops sold the same products to the same customers. This repetition created a sense of permanence. It felt as though nothing fundamental was changing, even as the country slowly transformed in ways no single person could fully see. Transportation improved, but at a pace that felt natural. Roads were extended, trains became more reliable. Later, cars appeared in greater numbers. Yet each change blended into the existing routine. A new road did not feel like a revolution. It felt like a slightly shorter commute. A new machine did not feel like the future. It felt like a more efficient tool. Most people did not think in terms of progress. They thought in terms of convenience. If something made life easier, it was adopted. If it did not, it was ignored. There was no collective awareness that the nation was evolving. There was only the quiet accumulation of small adjustments accepted without ceremony. Even politics, when it entered daily life, often did so in dull ways. Elections came and went, names changed, policies shifted, but the daily experience of most citizens remained largely the same. Taxes were paid, laws were followed, complaints were made. Then work continued. The structure of the state existed in the background like a distant machine that rarely demanded attention unless it malfunctioned. Families organized their lives around stability. Children went to school not to become historical actors, but to become workers. Education was practical. It taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and discipline. The goal was not self-expression or innovation, but reliability. To be useful was more important than to be original. Religion, for many, provided a similar function. Weekly services created a shared schedule. Sermons reinforced patience, duty, and restraint. Faith did not encourage people to change the world, it encouraged them to endure it. In this way, belief systems supported the same slow continuity as work and routine. Silence played a major role in shaping this era. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of normality. There were no constant broadcasts, no endless streams of information. Much of life happened without commentary. People did not narrate their experiences. They lived them and then moved on. When historians later tried to define turning points, they often struggled with this period. There were no clear beginnings or endings, no moment when one could say, here is where everything changed. Instead, there were overlapping processes: urbanization, industrialization, bureaucratization. These words described patterns, not experiences. For the people living through them, nothing felt like a pattern. It felt like Tuesday. The nation was not consciously building itself, it was maintaining itself, and in doing so, it created structures that would last longer than any single generation. Roads, schools, offices, habits, expectations, these became the invisible framework of modern life. They were not designed in a single plan, they emerged through repetition. This kind of history does not produce heroes, it produces systems. It does not create legends, it creates schedules. The people who shaped the country most deeply were not leaders or visionaries. They were clerks, farmers, mechanics, teachers, drivers. They did not intend to shape anything, they simply showed up. And yet, this is precisely how the nation woke up. Not through sudden awakening, but through slow adjustment. Each day looked almost identical to the one before it, but over decades, those days accumulated into something new. The past became infrastructure, the present became routine, the future arrived quietly, disguised as another normal morning. No one announced the beginning of this era, no one noticed when it was happening. By the time anyone tried to describe it, it had already passed. The nation had not leaped forward, it had drifted, steadily and almost invisibly, into a different version of itself, one built not on dramatic moments, but on countless uneventful ones. Progress in America rarely arrived with applause. There were no countdowns, no ceremonies, no clear moments when people stood still and said, "Now we are modern." Instead, change crept in quietly, disguised as convenience. A new track was laid, a larger building appeared, a machine replaced a person. None of it felt historic at the time. It felt practical, necessary, and soon completely ordinary. Railroads did not announce themselves as symbols of transformation. They were built because goods needed to move. Farmers wanted access to markets. Factories needed raw materials. Towns wanted connection. The tracks stretched across landscapes not as monuments, but as solutions. Each new line reduced distance, shortened time, and slowly reshaped how people understood space. But to the passengers, it was just a faster way to arrive somewhere. For many Americans, the railroad became part of the background almost immediately. At first, the sound of trains was novel, even disruptive. Whistles cut through quiet towns, smoke drifted across fields. But soon, these sounds blended into daily life. Schedules formed around arrival times, businesses aligned themselves with stations, property values shifted. Yet no one gathered to reflect on what was being built, they simply adopted. Factories followed a similar pattern. They did not begin as grand symbols of industry, they began as workshops that grew larger than expected. One machine led to another. One shift became two. One building expanded into a complex. The factory floor filled with repetitive motion, hands, levers, belts, gears. Each worker performed a small task, often without seeing the final product. The system worked not because of vision, but because of division. Most factory workers did not feel like participants in a revolution. They felt tired, they felt bored, they felt replaceable. The idea that they were contributing to a new economic order did not match their daily experience. Their world consisted of time cards, supervisors, noise, and routine. Progress in this form was not inspiring, it was exhausting. Cities grew in the same uncelebrated way. There was no single moment when a town became a city. There was only expansion. More people arrived, more buildings were constructed, streets extended outward, transportation systems became denser. What had once been walkable became crowded. What had once been personal became anonymous. But this transformation happened in increments small enough to feel natural. Urban life did not announce itself as a new lifestyle. It emerged from necessity. People moved closer to work, businesses clustered together, services followed population. Soon, entire neighborhoods existed where fields had been. The skyline changed slowly, one structure at a time. No one stood still long enough to notice the full shape of what was forming. Technology supported this growth, but rarely took credit for it. Electricity entered homes not as a symbol of modernity, but as a better alternative to candles. Telephones replaced letters not because they were revolutionary, but because they were faster. Machines replaced manual labor not because they represented the future, but because they reduced cost. Each innovation justified itself through efficiency, not imagination. As a result, people did not think of themselves as living in an age of transformation. They thought of themselves as adjusting to new tools. The language of progress remained abstract. The experience of progress was practical. A brighter light, a quicker message, a shorter commute. These were not offense, they were improvements. Even economic growth lacked celebration. Production increased, wages shifted, markets expanded, but these changes appeared as numbers on paper, not as visible milestones. For most citizens, the economy existed as a distant concept. What mattered was whether rent could be paid, whether food was affordable, whether work was available. National prosperity did not always translate to personal security. The pace of change created a strange illusion that nothing significant was happening. Because each transformation was incremental, it felt temporary. A new building seemed like just another building. A new machine seemed like just another machine. A new job seemed like just another way to earn money. Only in retrospect did these layers form a recognizable pattern. Government policy reinforced this quiet evolution. Regulations, infrastructure projects, labor laws, and economic frameworks were introduced gradually. Committees debated, reports were written, budgets were approved. None of it felt dramatic. The machinery of administration expanded in silence, shaping daily life through rules most people never read. Education adopted as well. Schools shifted their focus toward practical skills. Literacy, numeracy, punctuality, and obedience became central values. The goal was not intellectual transformation, but workforce preparation. Students learned how to fit into existing systems, not how to question them. Progress, again, was defined as functionality. Culturally, this period produced very little self-awareness. Art, literature, and media rarely captured the scale of what was occurring. When they did, it was often through nostalgia or anxiety, not analysis. People sensed that life was accelerating, but they did not have the language to describe it. The present always felt temporary, yet it kept extending. One of the defining features of this era was normalization. Every change became normal faster than it became understood. A new tool was strange for a year, then invisible for decades. A new system was controversial briefly, then unquestioned permanently. The process of adaptation was faster than the process of reflection. This is why progress felt uncelebrated. It did not pause long enough to be recognized. It arrived embedded within routine. It did not demand attention, it demanded adjustment. People did not feel like witnesses to history. They felt like participants in logistics. Even resistance to change often faded quietly. Those who opposed factories eventually worked in them. Those who disliked cities eventually lived in them. Those who feared machines eventually depended on them.
Adaptation was not a choice, it was a condition of survival within systems that kept expanding. The most powerful effect of this slow progress was psychological. People began to expect change without expecting meaning. They learned to accept new conditions without asking why. The future became something that happened automatically, without direction or purpose. It was not designed, it emerged. Over time, this created a culture that valued stability over understanding. As long as systems functioned, their origins were irrelevant. As long as trains ran, no one asked who built the tracks. As long as factories produced, no one asked how labor was organized. As long as cities worked, no one asked what they replaced. Progress in this sense became invisible labor. Millions of decisions, actions, and adjustments accumulated into structural transformation, but no single person could see the whole. Each individual experienced only a fragment: their commute, their job, their neighborhood. This is why there was no celebration. Celebration requires awareness. It requires recognition of an ending and a beginning. But this era had neither. It was a continuous middle, always moving, never arriving. The nation did not step into modernity. It drifted into it, one small improvement at a time. By the time anyone attempted to describe what had happened, the process was already complete. Railroads were normal. Factories were standard. Cities were unavoidable. The landscape had changed, but memory had adjusted. What once would have seemed extraordinary now felt inevitable. Progress did not declare itself. It disguised itself as routine. And in doing so, it became more powerful than any revolution because it reshaped the country without ever needing permission, attention, or celebration. History often remembers politics through speeches, elections, protests, and crises. But beneath all of these visible moments exists a quieter form of power: paperwork. Long before laws were felt in streets or workplaces, they existed first as drafts, memos, forms, and meeting notes. The modern American state was not built through dramatic confrontations alone. It was built through documents. In this era, politics did not feel like ideology. It felt like administration. Decisions were made in rooms without audiences, by people whose names rarely appeared in newspapers. They sat at long tables surrounded by folders, discussing wording, budgets, procedures, and definitions. The language they used was not emotional or inspiring. It was technical, careful, and slow. Most citizens never saw these processes. They only encountered the results: a new rule, a new office, a new requirement. They filled out forms, they waited in lines, they received letters with official stamps. Government became something experienced through interaction, not observation. People did not watch politics, they navigated it. Committees multiplied quietly. Every problem seemed to require a group: transportation committees, labor committees, education committees, housing committees. Each produced reports, each held meetings, each proposed frameworks and guidelines. These groups rarely made headlines, but they shaped how resources were allocated and how systems functioned. The committee structure created a new kind of political culture. Instead of individuals making bold decisions, groups made cautious ones. Responsibility was shared, which meant accountability was diluted. No single person was fully in charge, and no single person could be blamed. Power became collective, but also anonymous. Meetings became the core ritual of governance. People gathered not to debate values, but to review documents. Agendas were printed, minutes were recorded, votes were taken on phrasing. The most important political act was not speech, but agreement on wording. A single sentence in a regulation could affect millions of lives, yet no one outside the room would ever read it. This process felt slow, even boring, but that slowness was intentional. Bureaucracy was designed to prevent sudden change. Every proposal had to pass through multiple layers: review, revision, approval, implementation. This created stability but also inertia. The system moved forward but carefully, always protecting itself from disruption. For citizens, this meant that politics became procedural. Instead of asking what the government believed, people asked what the government required. The language of rights slowly gave way to the language of compliance.
Forms replaced conversations, applications replaced negotiations, legality replaced morality. Government offices expanded in the same quiet way as factories and cities. New departments were created, existing ones grew larger. Clerks, analysts, administrators, and inspectors filled rooms with desks and filing cabinets. The work was repetitive and rarely visible, but essential. Without these offices, nothing else functioned. Paper became the true infrastructure of the state. Every action generated documentation. Births, deaths, marriages, employment, property, education, taxation, all required records. Identity itself became something defined by files. To exist legally meant to exist on paper. This created a strange form of reality. A person could live somewhere, work somewhere, and contribute to society, yet remain invisible to the system if their documents were missing. Conversely, a person could be fully recognized by the system even if they were physically absent. The file became more important than the individual. Regulations multiplied quietly. They did not feel like laws, they felt like instructions. How to build, how to hire, how to transport, how to report. Each regulation addressed a specific problem, but together they created a dense network of control. Life became organized through compliance. Most people did not resist this. In fact, many welcomed it. Regulations provided predictability, they reduced uncertainty, they created standards, but they also transformed citizens into users of systems rather than participants in decisions. The language of power became technical, not political. Language played a crucial role in this transformation. Bureaucratic language avoided emotion, it used passive voice, it avoided blame, it focused on process rather than purpose. Instead of saying, the government demands, it said, it is required. Instead of saying, we decided, it said, it was determined. This language made power feel impersonal. Rules did not come from people, they came from systems, and systems could not be argued with, they could only be followed. Over time, this created a new political mindset. People stopped expecting change through persuasion. They began expecting change through procedure. If something needed to be altered, it required a form, a request, a review. Politics became something you submitted, not something you expressed. Even conflict was bureaucratized. Disputes were handled through appeals, hearings, reviews, and revisions. Instead of confrontation, there was process. Instead of protest, there was paperwork. Instead of revolution, there was regulation. This did not eliminate power struggles, it relocated them. Instead of occurring in public, they occurred in drafting rooms. Instead of being fought through speeches, they were fought through definitions. Whoever controlled the language of the documents controlled the outcome. The rise of professional administrators changed who governed the country. Expertise replaced popularity. Credentials replaced charisma. People who understood systems gained more influence than people who inspired crowds. Politics became a career, not a calling. This professionalization created a new class of political actors, not leaders, but managers. Their job was not to represent the public, but to manage complexity. They did not seek transformation, they sought efficiency. For the average citizen, this meant that government felt distant but constant. It was always present but rarely personal. It existed in mailboxes, offices, deadlines, and signatures. It was not something you believed in, it was something you dealt with. Over decades, this administrative structure became the foundation of modern America. Not ideology, not identity, but systems. Systems of health, education, transportation, labor, finance, each built through documents, meetings, and regulations. No one celebrated this transformation. There were no monuments to committees, no holidays for paperwork, no national stories about filing systems. Yet this was one of the most important changes in American history. The country did not become modern through revolution. It became modern through administration, through the slow accumulation of procedures, through the normalization of forms, through the quiet authority of offices. Power became invisible, control became routine, governance became background noise. And perhaps that was the greatest success of bureaucracy. It made politics feel boring. It removed drama, it removed spectacle, it replaced conflict with process. In doing so, it created a system that could operate indefinitely without needing attention. The modern American state was not built by heroes. It was built by clerks, by analysts, by people who attended meetings, took notes, drafted documents, and filed reports. They did not change the nation with vision, they changed it with structure. And because their work was slow, technical, and unremarkable, it became permanent, not because anyone demanded it, but because everyone adapted to it. The politics of paper and committees did not inspire anyone, but it organized everything. It shaped how people worked, learned, traveled, owned property, paid taxes, received services, and understood authority. It turned politics into infrastructure. And once politics becomes infrastructure, it no longer feels like politics at all.
Wars are usually remembered through images of movement, advancing armies, dramatic speeches, decisive battles, and moments that seem to change everything at once. History books prefer motion because motion looks meaningful. But for the people who lived through wars, especially in America, the dominant experience was not action, it was waiting. Most soldiers did not spend their time fighting. They spent it standing in lines, sitting in camps, cleaning equipment, following routines, and waiting for instructions. Days passed without events. Weeks blurred together. The body remained alert, but the mind drifted. War was not constant danger. It was constant uncertainty. Training camps became temporary cities. Rows of identical tents, shared meals, repeated drills. Every day followed a schedule designed to maintain discipline and prevent boredom, yet boredom always returned. Soldiers learned how to wait efficiently, waiting for food, waiting for mail, waiting for orders, waiting for something to happen. The idea of battle existed mostly as anticipation. Soldiers imagined what fighting would be like long before they experienced it. They prepared themselves mentally for fear, pain, and chaos, but preparation itself became another form of waiting. The future felt more real than the present. When combat did occur, it was often brief compared to the long periods of inactivity. A few hours of intensity were surrounded by weeks or months of stillness. And even those moments of intensity were often confusing rather than heroic. Smoke, noise, shouting, and fragmented memories replaced the clear narratives later created by historians. Afterward, memory returned to waiting. Waiting for injuries to heal, waiting for replacements, waiting for the next movement, waiting for the war to end. The emotional weight of conflict was carried not in moments of action, but in the spaces between them. Families experienced war in an even slower way. They waited for letters, they waited for news, they waited for silence to end. Communication was delayed, incomplete, and unreliable. A letter written weeks ago arrived describing a situation that had already changed. News reports summarized events that were already over. This created a strange emotional gap. Families reacted to the past as if it were the present. Fear arrived late, relief arrived late, grief often arrived without details. The war existed as fragments of information, never fully synchronized with reality. Writing letters became a central activity, not because people had much to say, but because writing was the only available form of connection. Letters described ordinary things, weather, meals, small changes at home. They avoided fear. They avoided truth. They maintained the illusion of normal life. Soldiers often wrote about boredom more than danger. They described routines, food, sleeping conditions, and jokes among companions. These details made war feel manageable, even when it was not. The act of writing itself became a way to pass time, to structure waiting into something meaningful. Civilians experienced war primarily through newspapers and radio. Reports were delayed, edited, and simplified. Battles were described in general terms. Casualties were presented as numbers. The emotional reality of war was reduced to headlines. For many, war became something abstract. It existed somewhere else, involving people they had never met. Daily life continued. Work, school, shopping, commuting. The war did not interrupt routine, it hovered around it. This created a strange dual reality. People knew something significant was happening, but it did not feel immediate. They felt concerned, but not involved. The emotional intensity of war was distributed unevenly, concentrated among those waiting for someone to return. Waiting produced a different kind of suffering than violence. It produced anxiety without release, fear without event, hope without confirmation. Time stretched. Days felt longer. The future felt unstable. Psychologically, waiting was exhausting. It required maintaining attention without stimulus. Soldiers had to remain ready for danger that might never arrive. Families had to remain hopeful without evidence. Civilians had to remain informed without understanding. Waiting also created new habits. People learned how to distract themselves. They developed routines to make time pass. They counted days. They marked calendars. They measured war not by victories, but by duration. In many cases, the end of war felt anticlimactic. There was no clear moment when waiting stopped. Orders arrived. Troops returned. Factories shifted production. Life resumed its previous shape, but with gaps where people had been. The emotional adjustment was slow. Soldiers returned to civilian life carrying memories that had no clear structure. They had experienced long periods of nothing followed by moments of intensity. This made it difficult to explain what war had been like. Language failed. Stories felt incomplete. Families struggled to reconcile their imagined war with the real one. The war they had experienced was composed of letters, rumors, and delayed reports. The war their loved ones had experienced was composed of boredom, fear, noise, and waiting. These versions rarely aligned. Even national memory reflected this imbalance. Public ceremonies focused on sacrifice and victory, not on waiting. Monuments commemorated battles, not boredom. Yet boredom had been the dominant experience for most participants. Waiting also changed how people understood time. The future became uncertain. Planning felt fragile. Life was organized around postponement. People delayed decisions, projects, relationships. Everything waited until after the war, even when no one knew when after would be. This created a strange culture of suspension. Life existed in a temporary state. People lived in the present but oriented toward a future that was undefined. The war was always ending, but never ended. The emotional tone of this era was not excitement or anger. It was low-level tension, a constant background awareness that something was wrong, but nothing could be done about it. Waiting turned war into a psychological condition rather than a series of events. It shaped how people thought, felt, and related to time. It created a generation accustomed to uncertainty, delay, and emotional distance. When historians later reconstructed these wars, they focused on decisive moments, but those moments were exceptions. The rule was inactivity. The dominant memory was stillness. War, for most Americans, was not experienced as history. It was experienced as interruption, an extended pause in normal life, filled with routines that felt temporary but lasted for years. Even fear became repetitive. At first, fear was intense. Then it became habitual. People learned how to live with fear. They stopped reacting. Anxiety became background noise. This normalization of waiting had long-term effects. It changed expectations about authority, time, and communication. People became accustomed to delayed information, centralized control, and passive endurance. Waiting taught patience, but also helplessness. It taught people how to adapt, but also how to accept uncertainty without protest. In this sense, war did not only reshape borders or economies, it reshaped psychology. It trained people to exist within systems they could not influence, to endure situations they could not escape, and to trust processes they did not understand. The most common war story was not about bravery. It was about passing time, about standing in line, about staring at clocks, about checking mailboxes, about reading the same newspapers over and over. These experiences rarely appeared in official narratives. They were too ordinary, too quiet, too repetitive, yet they were the substance of war. If war is remembered honestly, it should not be remembered through explosions or speeches. It should be remembered through waiting rooms, empty days, unfinished conversations, and calendars marked with uncertain dates. Because for most people, war was not something that happened, it was something that lasted. And what lasted the longest was not violence, but waiting.
The American economy did not feel like a machine. It felt like weather. It was always present, always changing slightly, and rarely understood in full. People did not wake up thinking about markets or interest rates. They woke up thinking about rent, groceries, fuel, school fees, and whether their paycheck would arrive on time. The economy, for most people, was not an abstract system. It was a background condition of daily survival. Banks opened quietly, one branch at a time. New buildings appeared on familiar streets, offering loans, savings accounts, and mortgages. They did not announce themselves as symbols of financial power. They presented themselves as services, places to store money, places to borrow, places to ask questions. Over time, they became permanent features of towns and cities, as ordinary as grocery stores or post offices. Most citizens did not understand what banks actually did with their money. They trusted the system because they needed to. The idea of finance was distant and technical. What mattered was access to credit, access to savings, access to stability. The bank became a mediator between people and the future. It allowed people to delay payment, spread risk, and imagine long-term plans. Markets, meanwhile, rose and fell in ways that felt mysterious. Numbers changed, headlines appeared. Sometimes people felt optimistic, sometimes they felt anxious. But the connection between those numbers and everyday life was unclear. A market crash might affect pensions, jobs, or prices, but rarely in immediate, visible ways. The consequences arrived slowly, distributed across months or years. This created a strange emotional relationship with the economy. People knew it was important, but they did not feel directly involved. They sensed its movements without controlling them. The economy seems to operate independently, like a system with its own logic, beyond individual influence. Wages shifted in small increments, a raise here, a cut there, a new job with slightly better pay. Inflation quietly reduced purchasing power. Prices increased gradually. What once felt affordable became expensive without a clear moment of change. People adjusted their habits, bought less, substituted cheaper options, delayed purchases. This gradualism made economic transformation difficult to notice. There were no clear turning points. Living standards changed slowly enough that memory adapted. People compared their present not to the distant past, but to the recent one. As long as things were not dramatically worse, they felt acceptable. Employment followed the same pattern. Jobs disappeared quietly and reappeared in new forms. Manufacturing declined, services expanded. Offices replaced workshops, screens replaced tools. But no one announced this shift as a historical event. Workers simply followed opportunities, retraining when necessary, relocating when possible. The economy did not feel like progress or decline, it felt like adjustment, a continuous process of rebalancing, where nothing stayed exactly the same for long, but nothing changed fast enough to demand reflection. Consumer culture reinforced this feeling. New products appeared constantly: appliances, electronics, clothing, entertainment. Each promised improvement. Each became outdated quickly.
The cycle of consumption created a sense of constant motion without direction. People bought things not because they needed them, but because they were available. Advertising played a central role in this process. It did not describe economic systems, it described desires, comfort, efficiency, happiness, status. The economy presented itself not as labor or production, but as lifestyle. People experienced economic growth through shopping, not through statistics. Debt became normalized. Credit cards, loans, and mortgages allowed people to live beyond their immediate income. The future became something to be paid for in advance. This shifted the meaning of time itself. Life was no longer organized around what one had, but around what one expected to earn. This created a permanent sense of movement. Even when wages stagnated, spending continued. Even when prices rose, consumption adapted. The economy appeared resilient not because it was stable, but because people constantly adjusted to its pressures. Government policies shaped this process quietly. Interest rates changed, tax structures shifted, subsidies appeared and disappeared. These decisions influenced investment, employment, and consumption, but rarely in ways people could trace directly. Economic power was diffused across institutions, making responsibility difficult to locate. Recessions felt like slow-motion disruptions. Jobs were lost, businesses closed, confidence declined. But the collapse was rarely immediate. It unfolded over time, through layoffs, reduced hours, postponed plans. The economy did not stop, it slowed. Recoveries felt even less dramatic. New jobs appeared gradually, wages stabilized, spending returned cautiously. There was no clear moment when one could say the crisis was over. People simply noticed that things felt slightly easier than before. This constant motion produced a culture of economic endurance. People learned how to live within uncertainty. They expected fluctuation. Stability became relative, defined not by security but by continuity. As long as income existed in some form, life continued. Economic identity replaced political identity for many. People defined themselves by profession, income level, and consumption patterns. Class became less about ideology and more about lifestyle. The economy shaped social structure more effectively than any law or institution. Over time, economic language entered everyday speech. People talked about investments, returns, efficiency, value, cost-benefit. These concepts became ways of thinking about relationships, education, and even personal development. Life itself became an economic project. This did not feel oppressive, it felt normal. The logic of the market blended into daily reasoning. People evaluated choices in terms of productivity and opportunity. Time became something to manage. Skills became assets. The self became a resource. The economy kept moving because it was built on adaptation. When one sector declined, another emerged. When one product failed, another replaced it. The system did not seek equilibrium, it sought continuation. This created a paradox. The economy felt stable precisely because it never stopped moving. Its constant motion prevented any single state from lasting long enough to be recognized as permanent. People adjusted expectations faster than conditions changed. Even inequality followed this pattern. Differences in income and opportunity expanded slowly. They were noticeable, but not shocking. Each generation accepted its conditions as normal, comparing upward or downward only within limited reference points. Economic identity concentrated gradually. Large institutions grew larger, small businesses struggled. Yet this shift felt natural, framed as efficiency or competitiveness. The language of the market disguised structural changes as individual outcomes. Through all of this, daily life continued. People worked, people paid bills, people worried, people planned. The economy was never experienced as a single event, it was experienced as a continuous background process. No one celebrated its movements, no one announced its phases. There were no ceremonies for rising interest rates or changing wage structures. The economy transformed society without ever demanding attention. It reshaped where people lived, what they valued, how they measured success, and how they imagined the future. But it did so slowly enough that these changes felt internal,
personal and natural. The economy did not feel like history, it felt like life. And because it never stopped moving, it never became visible. It remained what it had always been, an unexciting but constant force quietly organizing the conditions of everyday existence.
Technology rarely entered American life as a spectacle. There were no grand announcements, no countdowns, no collective moments of realization. New inventions did not arrive as symbols of the future. They arrived as tools. They promised convenience, efficiency, and comfort, not transformation. And because they blended so easily into daily routines, most people never felt that their lives were being fundamentally reshaped. Electricity is often described as a turning point, but for most households it appeared quietly. A worker came to install wires, a switch was added to the wall, a light replaced a lamp. The room became brighter, but life remained the same. People did not gather to celebrate the arrival of electric power. They simply stopped using candles. At first, electricity felt like a luxury. Only certain neighborhoods had access, only certain buildings were connected. But over time, it spread outward, street by street, town by town. What began as an exception became an expectation. Darkness no longer meant night, it meant the absence of a working bulb. The change was subtle but profound. Daily schedules shifted, work extended into the evening, reading became easier, social life moved indoors, but these adjustments felt natural. They were not framed as technological shifts, they were framed as improvements to comfort. The telephone followed a similar path. At first, it was an object of curiosity. People were unsure how to use it. Conversations felt awkward, voices traveled without bodies. The experience was strange, even unsettling, but soon the novelty faded. Phones became practical. They reduced travel, they replaced letters, they created new expectations of availability. People no longer waited days for information, they expected responses immediately. Yet no one described this as a revolution in communication. They described it as convenience. The language around technology was always modest. Devices were marketed as helpers, not disruptors. Machines promised to save time, reduce effort, and improve efficiency. They did not promise to change identity, culture, or psychology. But that is exactly what they did. Radios entered homes as entertainment. Families gathered around a box that produced sound from nowhere. Music, news, voices from distant places filled living rooms. At first, this felt magical, but soon it became routine. Radio restructured time. People adjusted schedules around broadcasts. National events became shared experiences. The same voices were heard in thousands of homes at once. But this new form of collective attention did not feel like a shift in social structure. It felt like listening. Later, other machines followed. Washing machines replaced manual labor. Refrigerators replaced ice boxes. Vacuum cleaners replaced brooms. Each device removed a small amount of physical effort from daily life. Work became easier. Time was saved. Fatigue was reduced. But something else happened as well. Expectations changed. Once a task became automated, manual effort felt unnecessary. What had once been acceptable became inefficient. Comfort became a standard, not a bonus. This is how technology reshaped life without drama. It did not demand new values. It created new habits, and habits are rarely questioned. They are simply repeated. The home became the central site of technological change. Machines entered kitchens, living rooms, bedrooms. They altered how people cooked, cleaned, communicated, and entertained themselves. But because these changes happened inside private spaces, they felt personal rather than historical. Technology was not experienced as public transformation. It was experienced as domestic improvement, a better stove, a faster message, a clearer signal. The scale of change remained invisible because it was distributed across millions of individual experiences. Even workplaces transformed quietly. Typewriters replaced handwriting, calculators replaced mental arithmetic, computers later replaced filing cabinets. Each step made work faster and more abstract,
People interacted more with screens and less with objects, but these shifts were described as upgrades, not redefinitions of labor. Automation entered factories slowly. Machines took over repetitive tasks. Productivity increased. Fewer workers were needed, but layoffs happened gradually. New roles appeared. The process felt natural, even inevitable. Technology did not arrive as a threat, it arrived as efficiency. This created a culture of acceptance. People learned to trust machines. They relied on systems they did not understand. When something worked, they did not ask how. When something failed, they waited for a technician. Knowledge became specialized. Ordinary users no longer understood the tools they used. Technology became opaque. It worked through interfaces, buttons, screens, and signals. Interaction replaced comprehension. This separation changed how people related to the world. Instead of understanding processes, they learned to operate devices. Skill became procedural. Knowing how replaced knowing why. Over time, this created a new form of dependence. Daily life required functioning systems. Electricity outages felt disruptive. Communication failures felt isolating. Mechanical breakdowns felt paralyzing. Technology became invisible infrastructure, essential but unnoticed. The emotional relationship with technology was neutral. People neither loved it nor feared it. They expected it. They assumed it would work. Its presence became background noise. Even when technology introduced new forms of behavior, they felt normal almost immediately. People learned to speak on phones without thinking. They learned to trust radio news. They learned to rely on machines for tasks once done manually. These behaviors became habits before anyone reflected on their meaning. This rapid normalization prevented critical awareness. By the time people realized something had changed, they could no longer imagine life without it. Memory adjusted. The past became inconvenient, outdated, inefficient. Technology did not produce a sense of living in the future. It produced a sense of living in the present more comfortably. The idea of progress was replaced by the feeling of convenience. Culturally, this created a strange relationship with innovation. People expected new tools but did not reflect on their impact. They welcomed improvements without questioning consequences. Technology became associated with practicality, not philosophy. Even major inventions felt small at first. The first personal computers seemed like office tools. The first digital devices seemed like toys. The first automated systems seemed like experiments. Their broader effects on communication, attention, memory, and identity emerged slowly. This is why technology never felt dramatic. Its most powerful effects were indirect. It changed how people thought about time, space, work, and connection, but it did so through habits, not announcements. The pace of change also prevented reflection. New devices appeared before people fully understood the previous ones. The present was always transitional. There was never time to stop and evaluate. Technology reshaped expectations about speed. Waiting became unacceptable. Delays felt frustrating. Instant responses became normal. Patience declined. Efficiency became a moral value. It reshaped attention. People focused on screens. Information became continuous. Silence became rare. Distraction became standard. Yet these shifts felt personal, not structural. Technology reshaped memory. Information was stored externally. Devices remembered things so people did not have to. Knowledge became accessible but shallow. The act of remembering was replaced by the act of searching. Social life reshaped social life. Relationships extended across distance. Physical presence became less necessary. Communication became frequent but brief. Emotional expression became mediated through devices. None of this felt revolutionary. It felt incremental. Each change was small enough to accept. Each device replaced a previous tool. Nothing disappeared completely. It was all substitution, not rupture. This is the true character of technological change in America. It did not arrive with drama. It arrived with upgrades. It did not demand new identities. It created new habits. It did not announce the future. It made the present more convenient. And by the time people realized how deeply technology had transformed their lives, it no longer felt like transformation. It felt like normal life.
Cities rarely announce their arrival. They do not begin with a clear moment or a single decision. They emerge slowly, through accumulation. A road is extended, a building is added, a bus route is created, an office opens where a field once existed. Over time, these additions form a pattern, and before anyone notices, a city exists. Urban growth in America did not feel like ambition, it felt like necessity. People moved closer to work, businesses moved closer to customers, services followed population. What began as small clusters became dense networks. The logic was practical, not emotional. Cities expanded not because people dreamed of urban life, but because life required proximity. Apartments replaced houses quietly. At first, they seemed temporary, designed for workers who needed short-term accommodation. But over time, they became permanent homes. Families lived vertically instead of horizontally. Space became shared. Privacy became limited. The idea of home shifted from land to floors. This change altered social relationships. Neighbors lived closer but interacted less. Shared walls replaced shared yards. Encounters became brief and anonymous. Urban life created physical closeness without emotional connection. Street systems organized movement. Grids replaced irregular paths. Traffic lights regulated behavior. Signs instructed direction. Movement became controlled, predictable, standardized. Walking, driving, commuting all followed designed routes. The city became a machine for circulation. Transportation systems expanded to support this structure. Trains, subways, buses, highways, each reduced distance and increased speed. People traveled farther to work. Cities extended outward into suburbs. The boundary between urban and rural blurred. Commuting became a defining experience. Daily life was organized around movement between home and work. Time was divided into departures and returns. The city was not lived in fully, it was passed through. Offices filled the urban core. Tall buildings concentrated labor. Work became centralized. Decisions affecting distant places were made in small rooms high above the street. The city became a site of coordination rather than production. Planning replaced organic growth. Zoning laws defined where people could live, work, and shop. Residential areas were separated from commercial ones. Industrial zones were isolated. The city was divided into functions. This functional structure shaped behavior. People traveled between zones instead of living within them. Life became segmented. Work here, home there, leisure elsewhere. The city became a schedule, not a community. Urban architecture reflected this logic. Buildings were designed for efficiency, not beauty. Materials prioritized cost and durability. Aesthetic expression became secondary to utility. The skyline grew taller, but not necessarily more meaningful. Public spaces existed, but they were regulated. Parks, squares, sidewalks, all designed to manage crowds rather than invite interaction. Urban life became controlled, supervised, monitored. Noise replaced silence. The constant presence of traffic, construction, machinery, and crowds created a background hum. Quiet became rare. Stillness became unnatural. The city trained people to live within constant stimulation. Yet, despite this intensity, urban life felt emotionally distant. People were surrounded by others, but rarely connected. Encounters were brief, transactional, anonymous. Relationships became specialized. Coworkers, neighbors, service workers, strangers. The city produced a new kind of identity. People defined themselves by profession, not by community. They belonged to networks rather than neighborhoods. Social life occurred in offices, institutions, and organizations, not in shared spaces. Economic activity dominated urban culture. Everything was oriented toward productivity. Time was measured in hours, deadlines, schedules. Movement was optimized. Efficiency became a moral value.
Even leisure was structured. Entertainment districts, shopping centers, cultural venues all organized consumption. Free time became another managed resource. Urban growth did not inspire collective imagination, it produced collective adaptation. People learned how to navigate systems, follow signs, use maps, understand schedules. The city required competence, not passion. This competence became a form of survival. Those who understood the city thrived. Those who did not felt lost. Urban life rewarded navigation skills more than creativity. The city also reshaped memory. Places changed quickly. Buildings were demolished, streets were renamed, neighborhoods were redeveloped. Personal history became unstable. The past disappeared physically. This created a culture oriented toward the present. The city did not preserve memory, it replaced it. What mattered was what existed now, not what existed before. Urban planning prioritized growth. Infrastructure was built for expansion, not preservation. The future was always assumed to be larger, denser, faster. The city did not seek equilibrium, it sought continuation. This produced a sense of inevitability. Urban growth felt unstoppable. People did not ask whether cities should expand, they asked how to manage expansion. The question of purpose disappeared. Even political power shifted toward cities. Administrative offices, corporate headquarters, cultural institutions, all concentrated in urban centers. Decisions were made far from where their effects were felt. This created a spatial separation between power and experience. People lived in cities shaped by decisions made elsewhere. Urban life became something managed from above. Despite this, cities did not feel imposed. They felt natural. They grew gradually. Each change was small enough to accept. A new building here, a new road there. No single moment demanded resistance. The emotional tone of urban growth was neutrality. There was no collective excitement, no shared vision. Cities expanded because systems required them to. People adapted because there was no alternative. Urban life became a condition, not a choice. People were born into cities. They learned how to live within them. They accepted congestion, noise, anonymity, and speed as normal. The city did not promise happiness, it promised opportunity, and opportunity justified discomfort. This logic shaped generations. Education, employment, and ambition became urban concepts. Success was associated with cities. Rural life became peripheral, associated with stagnation. Over time, the city became the default model of modern life, not because it was ideal, but because it was functional. Cities grew in silence because no one planned them as emotional spaces. They were planned as systems of movement, labor, housing, and control. They were not built to express values. They were built to manage complexity. And because they worked, they became permanent. Urban growth did not produce celebration, it produced normalization. The city became invisible. It was no longer experienced as a structure, it was experienced as reality. People did not say, I live in a city, they said, I go to work. They did not describe urban life, they lived it. And in living it, they forgot that it had ever been built at all.
Social change is often remembered through slogans, movements, and famous moments. It appears in photographs of crowds and recorded speeches, in dates printed in textbooks. But most social change in America did not arrive through declarations. It arrived through routines. It happened quietly, inside homes, schools, workplaces, and ordinary conversations, without anyone clearly naming it. Families changed first, and they changed slowly. The structure of the household shifted not because of ideology, but because of circumstance. Economic pressure required more than one income. Children spent more time in schools and institutions than at home. Extended families became separated by distance. What had once been shared daily life became occasional contact. These changes did not feel like social transformation. They felt like scheduling. Parents adjusted work hours. Children adjusted routines. Meals were eaten at different times. Conversations became shorter. Presence became intermittent.
The meaning of family shifted from constant interaction to coordinated availability. Education expanded in the same quiet way. More years of schooling became expected. Literacy increased. Specialization replaced general knowledge. Children were trained for roles that did not yet exist, in systems that were always preparing for a future slightly ahead of the present. Schools became spaces of normalization. They taught not only subjects, but behavior, punctuality, discipline, cooperation, competition. Students learned how to exist within systems, how to follow rules, how to evaluate themselves through grades and performance. This process reshaped identity. People defined themselves through credentials rather than lineage. Success became measured by achievement rather than inheritance. Education did not promise wisdom, it promised mobility. Gender roles shifted gradually, almost invisibly. Women entered the workforce not through collective decisions, but through necessity. Economic conditions required it. New opportunities allowed it. Cultural expectations adjusted afterward. There was no single moment when traditional roles disappeared. They simply became less functional. Household labor became mechanized. Professional work became more accessible. Independence became practical rather than ideological. Men also experienced change, though it was less often described. The meaning of masculinity shifted from physical labor to professional competence. Authority became less visible, more bureaucratic. Emotional expression became restricted by new social norms rather than old ones. These changes created tension, but not always conflict. People adopted individually, adjusting expectations within their own relationships. The social structure changed through millions of private negotiations, not public debates. Race relations followed a similar pattern of gradual transformation. Legal structures changed, but social behavior lagged behind. Formal equality did not immediately produce practical equality. Habits persisted. Attitudes evolved slowly. Integration did not feel like a national event in daily life. It felt like new classmates, new coworkers, new neighbors. Proximity replaced separation quietly. Interaction replaced distance without ceremony. Many people did not perceive these shifts as historical. They experienced them as personal. A new workplace policy, a different school environment, a changed neighborhood. These were not framed as social change. They were framed as life. Language played a crucial role in this process. The way people spoke about roles, identities, and expectations shifted over time. Certain expressions disappeared. New ones appeared. What was once considered natural became outdated. What was once controversial became normal. This linguistic change happened faster than awareness. People adopted new terms before understanding their implications. They adjusted behavior before forming opinions. Social norms moved ahead of ideology. Media reflected this transformation indirectly. Television, radio, and later digital platforms portrayed new types of families, new kinds of relationships, new social expectations. These representations did not argue for change, they presented it as reality. Over time, exposure replaced persuasion. Seeing different lifestyles made them acceptable. Familiarity reduced resistance. What appeared repeatedly felt normal, even if it would have seemed strange earlier. Workplaces became major sites of social change. Hierarchies flattened slightly. Diversity increased gradually. Professional identity replaced social background as the primary marker of status. Office culture reshaped behavior. People learned to interact across differences through institutional rules rather than personal beliefs. Politeness became standardized. Conflict was managed through policy. This created a new form of tolerance, procedural tolerance. People did not need to agree, they needed to cooperate. The system required functionality, not harmony. Social change also occurred through consumption. Products, services, and lifestyles influenced identity. What people bought, wore, watched, and listened to became expressions of self. Culture became individualized. This shift weakened collective identity. People no longer defined themselves primarily through community, they defined themselves through preference. Taste replaced tradition. Choice replaced inheritance. Technology accelerated this process. Communication became constant but fragmented. Relationships extended beyond physical proximity. Social networks expanded, but attention narrowed. People interacted with more perspectives but less deeply. Exposure increased, but understanding remained partial. Social awareness became broad but shallow. This produced a strange kind of change. People lived in more diverse environments without necessarily reflecting on diversity. Difference became background. It existed without being discussed. Even political movements that addressed social issues often lagged behind everyday change. Activism formalized what had already been happening informally. Laws recognized behaviors that had already become common. In this way, social change did not begin with ideas, it began with habits. People adjusted routines first. Beliefs followed later. This made social change difficult to trace. There were no clear starting points, no single causes, no obvious leaders. It emerged through countless small decisions made in isolation. A family choosing a different structure, a school adopting a new policy, a workplace hiring differently, a neighborhood becoming mixed. Each choice seemed insignificant. Together, they reshaped society. This form of change produced little resistance because it lacked visibility. People did not feel that anything was being taken from them. They felt that something was being added or simply altered. Social change felt less like loss and more like drift. Values shifted without confrontation. Norms evolved without conflict. Traditions faded without collapse. This created a culture of adjustment rather than transformation. People learned to live within new realities without naming them. They accepted new norms without understanding their origins. Over time, the past became difficult to imagine. What once seemed natural now felt outdated. Previous social structures appeared rigid even though they had once felt permanent. Memory adapted to the present. People forgot how recently things had been different. Social change became invisible because it had become complete. This is why it was never announced. It did not require announcement. It did not arrive as a message. It arrived as a condition. Social change did not ask permission. It did not wait for agreement. It did not require speeches. It happened while people were busy living their lives. And by the time anyone tried to describe it, it no longer felt like change at all. It felt like normal life.
American identity is often described through moments of crisis, victory, innovation, or conflict. History textbooks prefer dramatic scenes, speeches, elections, wars, discoveries, and cultural revolutions. But for most people, identity was not formed in exceptional moments. It was formed in repetition, in the same actions performed every day, in the same places at the same times, with small variations that barely mattered. Life was organized around schedules, not ideals, not philosophies, not national dreams, schedules. Alarm clocks, school bells, office hours, lunch breaks, closing times. The structure of daily life did not come from ideology, it came from routine. People woke up at similar times each day. They prepared for work or school in nearly identical ways. They traveled the same routes, stood in the same lines, sat in the same seats, returned home at similar hours, ate similar meals, and repeated the process again the next day. This rhythm was so stable that it stopped being noticed. Repetition created predictability. Predictability created comfort, and comfort created identity. Work became the central organizing force. Not meaningful work, not fulfilling work, just work. The act of showing up, completing tasks, and receiving payment. Employment was not a source of personal transformation. It was a structure that divided time into manageable units. People did not ask what work meant, they asked how long it lasted. The workday created the work week created the weekend created rest, and a rest existed only to prepare people to return to work. This cycle was rarely questioned. It felt natural, even necessary. School followed the same pattern. Children learned not only subjects, but timing, when to speak, when to listen, when to move, when to wait. Education was less about knowledge and more about synchronization. Students learned how to exist within systems, how to follow schedules, how to sit still, how to compete quietly, how to measure themselves through performance. This prepared them for work, not for thinking, not for understanding, but for repetition. Commuting became a defining experience of modern life. Millions of people traveled daily between home and workplace, often along the same routes, at the same times, surrounded by the same strangers. Commuting was not meaningful, it was transitional. It existed only to connect two routines. It consumed time without producing memory. Most people could not describe their commute in detail because it had no emotional content. Yet, commuting shaped perception. It created a sense of distance between personal life and professional life. It reinforced separation between who people were and what they did. The journey became a pause between identities. Shopping followed similar rhythms: groceries every week, clothes every season, household items when needed. Consumption became habitual, not intentional. People did not think about what they bought, they thought about what they needed to replace. Consumption was not desire-driven, it was maintenance. Stores organized themselves around this predictability. Supermarkets, malls, chain stores, all designed to accommodate repeated behavior. Layouts were standardized, products were familiar, choices were structured. The shopping experience was not meant to inspire, it was meant to be efficient. Even entertainment followed repetitive patterns: television schedules, radio programs, streaming habits. People watched similar content at similar times. Leisure became scheduled. Free time was not truly free. It was allocated, limited, and structured around obligations. Relaxation became another task, another activity to fit into the day. Repetition shaped memory. People remembered unusual events precisely because everything else felt the same. Weddings, holidays, accidents, trips, these stood out because they broke routine. But the majority of life disappeared into sameness. Weeks blended together, months felt interchangeable, years passed without clear distinction. This created a strange relationship with time. People felt busy but not fulfilled, active but not transformed. Life felt full but empty of milestones. Identity became procedural. People defined themselves by roles rather than experiences. Job title, student status, family position. These roles were stable because they were repeated. Change, when it occurred, felt disruptive rather than meaningful. A new job, a new schedule, a new routine. These were experienced as logistical problems, not personal growth. The goal of life became stability within repetition, to maintain the cycle without interruption, to avoid disruption, to preserve routine. Even ambition was framed in repetitive terms: work harder, earn more, upgrade lifestyle. But these goals did not break the cycle, they deepened it. More work required more scheduling, more income required more consumption, more responsibility required more routine. The system expanded, but the structure remained the same. This repetition produced a culture of endurance. People learned how to persist rather than reflect, how to continue rather than question, how to manage rather than understand. The emotional tone of daily life was neutrality, not happiness, not sadness, functionality. Life worked. That was enough. People became skilled at navigating systems, but less skilled at imagining alternatives. They knew how to exist within routines, but not how to design new ones. This created a subtle form of conformity, not ideological conformity, but temporal conformity. Everyone lived according to similar rhythms. Differences existed, but within the same structure.
Work hours varied, but everyone worked. Schools differed, but everyone attended. Commutes differed, but everyone traveled. Consumption differed, but everyone consumed. The repetition created shared experience without shared meaning. This is why American identity felt stable without being unified. People lived similar lives without interpreting them similarly. There was no single story, only similar schedules. Culture did not emerge from values, it emerged from patterns. Patterns of movement, patterns of labor, patterns of consumption, patterns of rest. These patterns shaped perception. People experienced the world through routine. They evaluated change based on how it affected their schedule. If something saved time, it was good. If it wasted time, it was bad. Efficiency became the primary value. This logic extended into relationships. Friendships were maintained through regular contact. Families interacted through scheduled events. Social life was organized around availability. Spontaneity declined. Planning increased. Life became something to manage. Even emotional expression became repetitive. Standard greetings, standard apologies, standard conversations. Language itself became automated. People spoke in phrases, not thoughts. They responded with habits, not reflection. This automation of behavior reduced awareness. People did not experience each day as unique, they experienced it as another instance of the same structure. The future felt predictable, not hopeful. It was expected to look like the present, only slightly faster, slightly more expensive, slightly more complex. This is why major historical events often felt distant. They disrupted news, not routines. Unless something directly altered schedules, it did not feel real. Wars were experienced through waiting, politics through paperwork, technology through upgrades, the economy through prices, but daily life remained repetitive. The culture of repetition absorbed everything. It absorbed crises, it absorbed innovations, it absorbed conflicts. Life continued. This repetition did not create heroes, it created habits. It did not produce meaning, it produced continuity. It did not shape memory, it erased it. And in doing so, it created the most powerful cultural force in modern America. Not belief, not ideology, not tradition, but routine. A life defined not by what happened, but by what kept happening.